Let me welcome all of you and welcome Michele Goodwin, our guest. I'm Anu Kumar. I'm president and CEO of Ipas. I'm sure most of you know that Ipas is an international reproductive justice organization. We work to expand access to abortion and contraception because we believe that everyone, no matter where they live and how much money they have, should be able to access safe abortion and determine their own futures. Ipas primarily works in low to middle income countries in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. And our US work is focused primarily on US foreign policy and its impact on reproductive freedom, as well as connecting our international experiences, of which we have a great deal of experience, to domestic experience. So I have a really interesting point of view on this issue of abortion. On the one hand, as an American, I see abortion rights being stripped away. But globally, I see progress from Argentina to Ireland to the DRC and most recently in Mexico. I'm thrilled to be here today with Michele Goodwin in the first live version of our series, Chats with Changemakers. Professor Goodwin is definitely a change maker. She's an author, an advocate, a professor of law, and a bioethicist. She hosts On the Issues, a podcast at Ms. Magazine, and she's written several books, including Policing the Womb, and has published many, many articles and commentaries for the New York Times, the LA Times, and more. We have a lot to talk about, as both Professor Goodwin and I have written and spoken about the threat of white supremacy that runs through anti-abortion and anti-rights movements and actions. We see this in our foreign policy, like the Helms Amendment. We saw this in the insurrection at the US Capitol, and now we're seeing it with the most recent law in Texas, which is empowering bounty hunters essentially to report anyone connected to abortion. So maybe let's just get started right there with the latest news. Professor Goodwin, can you just give us your reactions to the Texas law and the implications that it has? And as we were chatting before we got started, how is it that the Fifth Circuit can tell the federal court what to do here? Just lay the landscape out for us a little bit.
First of all, thank you so much for the important work that you do and inviting me to be in this conversation with you. It's an honor and privilege for me to be here with you. And you asked for my reaction. Well, it's alarming what it is that we have seen. And I would encourage people to think about this as our revisiting a playbook that is in seemingly an endless loop in the United States. If you understand and think about the origins in the United States, it's capitalism, what its capitalism relied upon. It relied upon stripping away reproductive autonomy, privacy, liberty, freedom from the people who were enshackled, enslaved, kidnapped from the shores of Africa and brought to the United States to build wealth and capital for states that bought into slavery. Primarily those were in the South, but not exclusively. In the Northeast, eventually they did away with slavery. But, at a certain point, 40% of the households in New York had enslaved people that worked for them in those households. But that endless loop includes something that's important for this conversation, which is that it was so deeply ingrained economically in the consciousness, in the culture of the United States, that the federal government enacted laws that would protect individuals who were slave owners, and then furthermore, provide incentives to random Americans to surveil, to spy upon, to track, and literally hunt down Black people as if they were chattel for food and another prey, right? And so if we look back and there's sort of mindful of that history, and we look at Boston, Philadelphia, et cetera, where there would be signs all around these communities urging Black people to be careful, not to come out in daylight, that there were bounty hunters that had a price on their heads. And then if we look at what was written into those laws, they were really quite pernicious and broad in their scope. So they provided bounties for people who were successful in the capture of Black people. But even more, what was fascinating about those laws is how they put a thumb on the scale of the bounty hunter and, of course, the slaveholders. And anything that we can think of now as kind of a judicial legitimacy or what's important in terms of upholding rights, they just simply didn't exist. And so if you're a Black person who was hunted down and was brought into court, you actually had no standing to even be able to speak, to even be able to say, well, I've 3 generations living in Philadelphia, 3 generations living in Boston. This is wrong. Silence, nothing. So then we sort of look at what is now. And I would say that we'd miss out a whole lot if we didn't think about Jim Crow. So after slavery, after its abolition, after Reconstruction, which lasts a very short period of time, the United States Supreme Court allows for this system of separate but equal laws. And I think that we'll see much of this as the kind of narrative that weaves out with what it is that we see in the gutting of Roe and Planned Parenthood v. Casey, because it is exactly that kind of playbook. Right? It is this kind of separate but equal status, really, of people who would otherwise seek to have control over their own reproductive destinies. It creates this hierarchy. So you've asked about the Fifth Circuit and the Texas case. And so let me just lay out really quickly the Texas law itself. We're talking about SB 8. Texas calls this a heartbeat bill. I say calls it that because I want to be clear that at 6 weeks of pregnancy, which is what it does, it denies the right to terminate a pregnancy after 6 weeks. At 6 weeks, there is no heart. There is an embryo. So the very notion of baking this language in, the heartbeat legislation, is a misnomer. And then I would hope that, journalists and et cetera would stop deferring into that kind of language. What the law also does is that it provides individuals to seek a bounty against anyone who aids or abets a person after 6 weeks of pregnancy in that termination of the pregnancy. Additionally, it allows for $10,000 at least if they're successful in identifying the person who aided or abetted. The law makes no definition of aid and abet, so it is very broad. So aid and abet could be the person who is the Uber driver or the taxi driver that transports someone to a clinic. It could be a family member who provides some economic support for this. It could be the receptionist at a clinic who registers the patient in. Additionally, it provides for attorney's fees as well. And one final note that I'll make, and then really quickly on the Fifth Circuit, is that what the law also does is it does a work around the traditional structure of laws. That is to say that within a state, when a governor signs a law into action, there is someone who's responsible in the state. Usually that might be the state's attorney general. It may be a secretary of some department, and that person is responsible for enforcement. What Texas decided to do here, and let's be clear, this was not the kind of brilliance of the legislature. This has been a very well-oiled, very well-funded machine in terms of people who have been paid to think about these issues, not a sprint, but a marathon. And the decision was make nobody responsible from the state to enforce, because then an individual could have standing and sue the state. We get out of the individual being able to sue us by saying it's just private enforcement. And you asked about the Fifth Circuit. Again, this is what brings us back to Jim Crow, because the Fifth Circuit did not allow the district court, when the law was challenged, to finish its fact finding that is important to every case and then decide whether it would impose an injunction or not. The Fifth Circuit acted in an incredibly unusual way to say that, no, we will intervene in this case. We will not allow for an injunction to go forward. And if you want to challenge this case, now you challenge it to the Supreme Court, which now has Amy Coney Barrett, which now has Brett Kavanaugh, which has Justice Alito, Justice Thomas, and a majority who is conservative. And finally, where in the Supreme Court, where the issue was considered, you have Chief Justice John Roberts standing out as a dissent.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for that. Yeah, pretty remarkable turn of events. I have to say that whole Fifth Circuit Federal District Court thing sent me down this rabbit hole of trying to understand the American judicial system. And I did not get a very satisfactory answer as to how this was allowed to happen in this way. So it's, I guess, somewhat heartening that you don't quite understand it either, and that that is unusual, and the implications are profound, it sounds like.
Yes, well, let me just say this. There is a way in which I do understand it, right? Like, I think it's
Yeah.
absolutely it's alarming, it's chilling, shouldn't happen. But the only way that I make sense of it is to
Mhm.
say that it it's hard to make sense of slavery, except that we know that economically it built wealth for individuals and their greed motivated them to keep a system in place that would allow for the retention of power and the maximization of power. We saw the same in terms of the kind of cultural resonance of all of that during Jim Crow.
Mhm.
And it's worth noting that during that period, there were Southern governors who also sought to defy federal law, right? They said, we will close schools down and have them chained before even one Black student is able to walk into this building. And so, nonsensible, hard to make sense of people who do not respect the human dignity and human rights of other people. But then again, understandable within the context of something that has always been a system that has dwelled upon, or a system that has always made caste out of its people.
Yeah. So you said something earlier about, in describing the Jim Crow South in terms of separate but equal. Are you suggesting that we are entering territory in the United States where women are separate but equal? Are we?
It's a great question. For some women, that's already been, again, the unending loop. So I think that there's a lot that can be learned from the journeys of women of color in the United States, particularly Black women. They've been the canaries in the coal mine, right? If we follow what the experiences have been of Black and Brown women, then we would be able to predict some of what comes next. Right. Now we think that because we're in a much more enlightened time where there's an appreciation that the Constitution does actually apply to women, right? We had a Constitution that had already had a 14th Amendment providing for equality, substantive equality, freedom, liberty, all of that. And we know that women were divested of those freedoms, liberties, and rights, including the right to vote. That then gets remedied. But I am speaking to the vulnerability of any time we can see that slip away. And that is where we are
Mhm.
as we look at the state of Texas.
Yeah, and so just want to point out that the United States is one of 7 countries that has not ratified the Convention Against All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, CEDAW, nor does the US Constitution guarantee equality for women, which is guaranteed in most constitutions globally. The United States is also the only country that has not ratified the Convention on the Rights of the Child, despite our supposedly pro-child, pro-life policies. So from the point of view of thinking about how the US fits into the world and fits into the international framework, we're not doing so well. And furthermore, the United States does not have any government entity that monitors US compliance with any international human rights standards. So from the point of view of sort of international human rights, we are very, very out of step with the global framework and with the global rights framework. And furthermore, we know from Ipas's experience in places where abortion is restricted that it will have a very damaging effect on women, particularly poor women, who in this country are often Black and brown women.
That's
We know from our
absolutely.
experience in Brazil that there will be police raids and that clinic records will be seized. We know that providers will be very confused about what to do in terms of providing treatment and care for pregnant women. So this is what's happening in Texas is not theoretical.
No,
It's
no, and certainly not theoretical anymore, right? So there have been those of us who've been writing about these issues for quite a long time, who've been saying these are the things that we ought to be concerned about. You mentioned my book, Policing the Womb. It was a 10-year project, and along the way, it was published last year. I published numerous articles, Yale Law Journal, Northwestern Law Review, op-eds, all of that, identifying what had already been taking place against Black and Brown women and predicting here are the things that come next. Because once precedent is established, once in law, or once a cultural norm of disregard takes shape, once we have a culture of personhood even if it's not baked into law, then eventually it's not just Black and brown women. It's white women too who then become affected by this. And so now we see, given how alarmed people are, how people now come to understand this. But let's be clear, in the 1980s and 90s, there were prosecutors during this era of the crack scare
Mhm.
uh, who targeted Black women, who surveilled them in
Mhm.
hospitals, doctors and nurses that
Mhm.
passed on private patient information to police, to prosecutors who began charging Black women with manslaughter and homicide after having miscarriages and stillbirths. In states like Wisconsin and Minnesota, enacting laws euphemistically called crack baby mama laws, but that allowed for the forced civil incarceration of any person for the protection of the fetus, and that would provide legal representation for the fetus against the pregnant woman. Now,
Mhm.
for many people today, they'd be alarmed by this. And now it's a time of hearing it because we see what's taking place in Texas. But what those were the things that were already occurring against Black and brown women.
Mhm. Yeah, and so we have a couple of questions in the chat, but I want to get to also about what can be done? Can this law be overturned? But I want to take us a little bit back. You've been giving us a great history lesson, and that we didn't just happen to get here one day. And there have been some really interesting articles of late about the lead author of this bill. Jonathan Mitchell is, I think, is his name. And he's been somebody who has been trying to essentially figure out how to remove the state from this enforcement aspect. And the bills that or the rulings, I guess, from city councils that occurred in Texas a few years ago about not allowing abortion providers to be to come into the city limits as part of this path this path of jurisprudence that's being laid out. What do you see as the next steps of what may happen? Personhood is clearly something that you've mentioned that could happen. But then, what do you see as sort of what can we do? Can these things be overturned now? Is it too late?
Mhm.
What do you think the DOJ? We've seen that the DOJ has filed suit. Does that suit have any chance of success?
So, what we will see now is, again, as I've mentioned, this has been a marathon, not a sprint.
Mhm.
It's been a very well funded movement that has had some of this most adept legal minds trying to figure out how to do exactly what we've seen done, right? These kind of
Yes.
workarounds. But they've also been involved in other types of legislation that we've seen coming out of other states, even though some of that legislation has not really caught public attention. For example, in the Dobbs case that the Supreme Court will be hearing, it involves a Mississippi anti abortion law. That anti abortion law bans abortions after 15 weeks of pregnancy. Like the Texas law, it provides no exceptions in cases of rape and incest. The reason why I mentioned that law, and that's a law where there has been an injunction that's been put in place. Judge Carlton Reed, his order for that injunction is a brilliant. It's a brilliant decision, and it's a brilliant decision because what the court speaks to, the district court imposing that injunction against Mississippi, is the history of oppression of women in the state of Mississippi, the unique history of the oppression of Black women, specifically in the state of Mississippi. The fact that in Mississippi, there were Black girls who were coercively and forcibly sterilized against their knowledge, against their will, and that all of this is part of the broader conversation. That case has now been challenged to the Supreme Court. So we'll continue to see a number of laws that make their way through state legislatures that are Republican dominated, where there is an anti-abortion kind of movement afoot. They will have different weeks in which they propose that abortion should become illegal. We'll continue to see those that involve no exceptions for rape or incest, which is incredibly unique. I mean, if you surveyed Republicans 10 years ago, that would have been something that couldn't have been in any, and most would say, no, you can't have an anti-abortion law that has that. We'll see that be normalized. The other thing that we'll begin to see anew is that we will begin to see more laws criminalizing not just doctors, but also the patients who are seeking to terminate the pregnancies as well. And we'll also see efforts for the criminal punishment of people who aid and abet along the way. Again, if we're to think about these issues from the history archive, that's of course what we saw with regard to race in the United States. What was allowed, if not in law, but the kind of social cultural norms of it's okay to burn down that press because that press was owned by an abolitionist. We won't figure out who the person was that killed the abolitionist. We'll just let that go and be very sloppy in terms of our investigation. Things like that, which today would seem alarming, but I would say 2 years ago, people would suggest, oh, well, Texas law like that never would exist. And so today, when I'm talking about criminalization and I'm talking about the weaponization, this is what I see coming forward. But you've also asked about, solutions and fights, and I'm happy to talk about that too.
Let's get to that in a minute. I just want to mention that actually the lack of exceptions for rape and incest is also very unusual globally. This is not common to have this kind of incredibly restrictive law, even around the world. And the criminalization of women, which has happened in other parts of the world, have resulted in women being in jail for either abortion or miscarriage, which is very difficult to discern the difference. And so we have literally seen women in Nepal be in jail for miscarriage, for induced abortions, for post-abortion care. We've seen women in Rwanda being jailed for the very same issues, women in El Salvador. So the criminalization of women themselves will result in not only the pathologizing and criminalization of pregnancy, but in the in jailing women and providers and families around them,
and the harms to their families as well. So again, if we're to look back at the playbook involving Black women and their criminalization, their children being shuttled off to foster care, and the harms that children experience when shuttled off into those systems. There's research that's been done by Kristen Turney. She's a sociologist that looks at the life consequences of children who have parents who've been incarcerated. So let's be clear, many people who would seek to terminate a pregnancy are people who are also moms, right? And so we're talking about targeting and tracking, people who have families and being removed from their families. And what this research shows is that children of incarcerated parents fare worse than children whose parents have died. So you think about the kind of psychological trauma that is right about to sort of be triggered for lots of people, not now just Black children or children of Latinx parents, but the scope of that, and it is alarming. But I should say, Anu, too, one of the things that is also really disturbing to me about SB 8 is the way in which it seeks to chill relationships, chill communication. And I can't help but think about it in relationship to domestic violence. One of the key aspects of domestic violence is that the person who's the perpetrator of that intimate violence is able to kind of create a wall around that person where that person feels uncomfortable and afraid to speak to anyone, and then just suffers that abuse alone, that deep trauma. And what Texas has done is to instantiate that in law. So Texas has made it such that if you are the 12-year-old girl who's been raped by an uncle and who now knows that she's pregnant or wonders if she's pregnant and wants to talk about an abortion, she now has to feel uncomfortable and worried that she would get her mother in trouble if she talked to her mother about a pregnancy termination.
Yeah, it's isolating, as you're saying. It's putting the woman in an island where she can't actually reach out and get the support that she may want and need. Certainly in our work, we've talked and done a lot of research on the issue of stigma, and this is codifying stigma and indeed criminalizing it, finding a way of actually being, punitive in that approach. So yeah, it's fascinating. We have a number of questions in the chat which are somewhat distracting me, but and I promise chat people I will get to them. I do want to ask you. I want to take you back to your thoughts around white supremacy and race and how that filters into this, because I had a colleague the other day who urged me to think about the differences between white supremacy and white nationalism. We can understand white supremacy as an institution or a systemic way of, a system of institutions and ideologies that that benefit white people on the backs essentially of Black and brown people. White supremacy is justified, as you've said, colonialism, genocide, slavery. But white nationalism is a movement in the US that builds on white supremacy. And white nationalism seeks not only to go back to a time of white dominance, but to dismantle the current state and remove non-white people and women from power. White nationalists are anti-rights. They extend their hate to LGBTQ people and others. We've seen domestic terrorists, the domestic terrorists who have used abortion clinics, in my view, as testing grounds for their violence. Eric Rudolph, which a lot of people may have forgotten about, but Eric Rudolph is an example of someone who, he's the guy that bombed the Atlanta Olympics. But then he'd also set off bombs at abortion clinics and LGBTQ bars.
Yeah.
And he claimed that legalization of abortion in the US was one of the reasons for his actions. So I'm curious from you, Michele, what do you see as these connections between, white supremacy, white nationalism, terrorism, and human rights?
So let's start by saying that every day in the United States, there is violence that is targeted at people who are providers and people who are patients who go into clinics where abortions are performed. And I mention that because it's become so normalized, right? That people are heckled and that these centers and clinics have to hire security guards. Volunteers show up to just be able to walk people in to get the medical care that they need. Since 1977 in the United States, there have been nearly 50 bombings of clinics that perform abortion. There have been mass shootings, including recently in Colorado. There has been the targeted, intentional murder of doctors and providers who perform abortions in the United States. And I mention that because it's important to understand that in any other context, we would call that terrorism. We would say that that's a terroristic organization, right? We'd say that there's a terroristic organization or organizations afoot and that they've bombed 50 clinics in the last 50 years. They've shot them up. They call in bomb threats, all of those kinds of things. We would be alarmed, except it's been normalized in this particular space. It's a great question that you ask, kind of disentangling the differences between the institutional white supremacy, which is subordinated women. We've seen before the United States Supreme Court cases over time where, women challenged the Constitution to be applied to them, such as I've gone to law school, I want to become a lawyer, and having the Supreme Court say, women are intended for the home. We will deny you the right to become a lawyer in the United States, and that being law of the land by the United States Supreme Court. Minor v. Happer said, I want to have the right to vote as a woman. And again, the Supreme Court denying that. So we have those histories, those systems. That's what we can talk about in terms of institutionalized sexism, institutionalized racism. It is when the state itself has promulgated laws, policies, and practices that deny the full inclusion and equal rights of specific categories of persons. The whole bevy of laws that were part of the Jim Crow playbook are that. And I'll just take a moment to just help people understand that Pauli Murray, who's such a great hero of everything, documented this in a book called Race Laws. The book is single space, nearly 800 pages, law after law, denying Black people the opportunity to swim in a pool, play billiards, ride in a taxi with white people. I mean, things that you wonder, like, really? You kind of thought of that, of all the kind of legislating that you could do. You passed a law saying Black people can't play billiards, they can't play pool. I mean, like seriously, like that's what you spend your time on, in addition to the kinds of things that we know about, such as denying equal opportunity with education and schooling. But this nationalism that you speak to, I think is really important that we understand that, because that's been part of something that we've considered fringe, tolerated in the United States, groups like the Posse Comitatus and others, or the Ku Klux Klan, right? But these kind of fringe militias and groups like that, kind of off in the woods, is the way in which most people thought of them in the 70s and 80s. But these groups have come out of the woods. These groups have marched in Charlottesville, 2017, leading to the death of Heather Heyer. These groups have now marched in Washington, D.C. They call themselves Proud Boys and other kinds of things. They march with their weapons and things like that, not to show that they have a First Amendment right to do so, but to have on full display their willingness to be violent. And so you package that alongside their lean into the anti-abortion movement. And we can see there that when those two come together, that's like lighting a match to the kerosene and to the gas. And that's really disturbing.
Yeah. Yeah. And I should note that Texas has over 50 hate groups. 54, I think, is the number from the Southern Poverty Law Center. So it has quite a number of hate groups that are present in Texas, and many that are statewide and encompass a number of things. They're not just about white nationalism, but they absolutely include anti-abortion, anti-rights, anti-LGBTQ. So they're equal opportunity in that sense.
Absolutely. And they are, and I'm glad that you mentioned that. In Texas, a place that has made owning a gun as something that's like a right that's associated with being able to drink water. And so you sort of add in that kind of passion of gun ownership and being able to weaponize, and then the weaponization that the state is allowed for with SB 8. And that's also what makes this really quite chilling and alarming, given the backdrop that we already know in terms of the violence that's been part of the anti-abortion movements in the United States.
Yeah, yeah. Just a note to our participants, we are gathering up all your questions, and we shall definitely be addressing them shortly. So please don't fret. We shall get to them soon. I do want to just kind of shift gears a little bit and talk about access to abortion. Roe never promised access. It never guaranteed access for all, and lack of access to healthcare is, of course, tied to inequity. And we see this in the United States, where Black women are 3 to 4 times more likely to die from pregnancy-related causes than white women. And we see an echo of this disparity globally. So we know that maternal deaths in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia account for 86% of all global maternal deaths. And there's so many pledges and promises that have been made to reduce the maternal mortality ratio, but we're not there. Black and brown women everywhere continue to pay the ultimate price. And that brings me to the Helms Amendment and to the global gag rule.
I was just thinking, Jesse Helms was just coming to mind as you were queuing up that question. I was thinking Jesse Helms.
That's right. Exactly. And one of the pieces that I read of yours, Michele, was one of the law review articles, was on U.S. foreign policies. And so, you've written about these policies, the Helms Amendment and the gag rule and others that restrict foreign aid. Can you just explain and tell me a little bit about how you think these policies increase inequality? And do you see a connection between what's happened in Texas and the US more broadly to our foreign aid policies? And what is that connection?
So this actually connects to your prior question as well, right? So white supremacy, nationalism, and let's add the religious piece onto that too. So Jesse Helms was really quite clever. In Congress, the way in which fellow senators chose to deal with him was almost as if the uncle who says unkind things at Thanksgiving, and we'll just give him a pass. But he was very shrewd. He knew what he was doing. He was cultivating. Evangelicals. He was cultivating an ultra right that would which would eventually emerge as the right. People that would be that were in the 1970s and 80s not a part of anything that could be defined as republicanism whatsoever, who now are part of the kind of mainstream of republicanism. But Jesse Helms was anti-abortion. He's a senator who served in the United States Congress. He was opposed to abortion rights. He was opposed to the United States government having any kind of funding, doing any kind of funding with relation to abortion, domestically and abroad. He was successful at being able to gut essentially funds that could otherwise be available abroad for people who would be able to terminate a pregnancy. It's worth noting that this was taking place right in the backdrop of Roe v. Wade. So it was a very interesting thing to see that the Supreme Court 7-2 in 1973 in Roe v. Wade striking down laws that criminalized abortion, thereby, and in Roe reading the decision by Justice Blackmun. And let me just say this, that of those 7 justices, 5 of them were Republican appointed. Blackmun, who wrote the opinion, was appointed to the court by Richard Nixon, right? And so that too is a very deep shift from what we see now as this is about liberty, this is about privacy, this is about autonomy, and even more, if I could just take a moment on Roe, which helps us to then think about the contrast offered by Helms, was that in the opinion, Justice Blackmun talks about how a woman might suffer from carrying a pregnancy that she doesn't want, suffer physically, suffer mentally, suffer economically, suffer in terms of educational attainment. I mean, he makes it very clear that this is a bad idea when there's any interference in a woman's life chance when she's forced to carry a pregnancy that she does not want. It could kill her, but it can also kill her opportunities. And what it does is it leads to what can be a lifetime of stigma and also stereotype too, if she lives in a community where she's pregnant and not married, right? He goes through all of that. And so then we have Jesse Helms, who basically says, look, that really doesn't matter for women abroad. That really doesn't matter. What we're seeing in the United States as carving out life opportunities for women here, including Title VII and Title IX, and a real pathway to seeing women be able to control their own destinies. Helms is not concerned about that for Black and brown women. And not only is he not concerned about it, he is motivated to make sure that it can't happen. And so what we ultimately end up having is then the Helms Amendment. But then when Ronald Reagan comes into office, and again, these interconnections which you've laid out, white supremacy, nationalism, Ronald Reagan comes into office after having campaigned in Mississippi, launching his campaign for the presidency from Philadelphia, Mississippi. Now, you might wonder why any governor from California would think that he needs votes from Mississippi, would bother to make the Mississippi stop in Philadelphia. But let's be clear, the one thing that Philadelphia, Mississippi is known for is the brutal killing of young civil rights workers who went to Mississippi to register Black people to vote. And that's where Ronald Reagan chose, I think quite selectively, intentionally, to be there. And when he was there, part of his speech, because we get this language of the welfare queen, we get that from Ronald Reagan. It is in Philadelphia, Mississippi, where part of his speech is about we need to do something about this welfare queen who's sucking up all of our resources. And we have then the Mexico City policy that comes from Ronald Reagan that further gags. It is what is considered the global gag order that denies clinics and hospitals and doctors who otherwise would be working with patients from being able to perform abortions and talk about abortions.
Mm-hmm. And interestingly, in that piece, it was the first time that I realized that Helms actually did not vote for his own amendment.
This is what's so cruel. That's right. I mean, this is how Jesse Helms rolled, right? So Jesse Helms, basically said this package isn't going through, this USAID package, unless you take seriously that I want this particular provision included. And so, in deference to Jesse Helms, others leaned in and said, okay, fine. And then still
Yeah,
didn't vote for the package anyway because he didn't care for countries that were vulnerable to receive aid from the United States anyway.
exactly. That's how much how much disdain he had for poorer countries, poorer people, anyone other than himself. He
Absolutely.
it's quite shocking. And he even proposed at that time the Mexico City policy.
Yes,
He gave that idea already to
that's right.
the Republican establishment, in which they then seized on when they had the opportunity to do so later with Reagan in Mexico City. In many ways, Helms, and the more I've read about him, because the Helms Amendment is still with us 50 years later. That amendment is still with us, and it impacts all of the millions and millions of dollars of aid that this country gives away. It has literally impacted the lives of millions of people around the world.
It's
The
a
action of one senator, lives on to this day and has done such damage to the reproductive health and rights field, and to women's lives, around the world. In so many ways, to me, Helms is like the proto-Trump. He knew his messages. He knew who he was talking
And
to.
even smarter, right? But yes, absolutely. That's right. And in fact, it's important that you mention that because he had been in radio,
Yeah,
right? So as Trump had been in television, he had been in radio. He had been in PR, right? So public relations, radio, etc. He knew how to frame a message. He knew how to hit
yeah,
people at their vulnerabilities, how to message to people such that he could be able to win them over and to be able to convey a message that was deeply about race. I mean, he was an incredibly misogynist. He was racist in his ideology, and he knew how to make people who had vulnerabilities in their own lives. I'm talking about poor white people, feel as if that had been caused by a women's movement, by feminism, by Black people, by Dr. King, right? I mean, and of course, what's so interesting about that, he's the senator representing them, right? The sort of obvious person to be concerned about if you're not reaching
yeah,
your life chances is a person that you've just elected to the Senate, and not women in New York and California, not Dr. King in Atlanta or in Alabama. But how about you, Senator? Make sure that we have the opportunities to thrive in this state. But he was able to obfuscate,
yeah,
right? He was very
yeah.
clever in that way. But you also mentioned something else, which is that Roe was not a panacea. It wasn't. So on one hand, I think the language, it's worth highlighting Justice Blackmun. I think that his sensitivity and concern to the lives, the lived lives of women is really meaningful and important. But the Supreme Court really failed women after that in a series of cases where the Supreme Court made a distinction when it came to abortion, stating that while states and the federal government could support financially a person's pregnancy to term and even provide provisions for after pregnancy, that the state and the federal government was not obligated to do that in the case of terminating a pregnancy. And that made a real distinction in terms of who Roe reached to. So it became such that if you were poor, you're a woman of color, but just being poor, it meant that you were coerced into pregnancy when you may have wanted an abortion, and when an abortion would have been far less expensive for the state to underwrite than coercing you into a pregnancy that you did not want.
Yeah, yeah, and I just want to mention the Turnaway Study, which is if it needed to be proven that not having access to abortion has negative life consequences for the woman and her child, the Turnaway Study does that. It's a long-term study, and I recommend anyone who's interested in that issue to find it. It's in the Answer website. So let us turn to our questions. But before we do so, well, one of the questions is actually, what can we do? Because we know there are going to be copycat laws. Several states have already said that they're going to follow this example of the Texas legislation. So, what can we do about this? I want to mention that there are two things, two bills in Congress that we can work to support. One is the Women's Health Protection Act, which protects the right to access abortion care throughout the US, creating a statutory right for healthcare workers to provide abortion care and a right for patients to receive that care. And then the second bill is the Abortion is Healthcare Everywhere Act, which would repeal the Helms Amendment and ensure that US foreign assistance can be used to provide comprehensive reproductive health care and information, including abortion. Michele, what else would you add in terms of what can we do?
So there are strategies that we can look to. So the first announcement that came after the Supreme Court declined to intervene against the Texas law coming into effect, Merrick Garland, the Attorney General, said, well, we will enforce the FAIR Act. Now, some said that's just like calling the police when there's a fire. So the FAIR Act provides that people shall not be interfered with as they go to terminate a pregnancy. So, literally protecting people from the physical obstacles and other kinds of obstacles that could be incurred with terminating a pregnancy. So that's fine, except that in Texas, clinics are saying we're no longer going to be providing abortions, so that's not going to be helpful. But the DOJ recalibrated and is now framed their action against Texas as one that really does resemble what the federal government sought to do during the period of Jim Crow, when there were states that were recalcitrant, said we don't have to follow Brown v. Board of Education, we don't have to desegregate our parks, we don't have to desegregate our schools, we don't have to, desegregate our buses, and we could go down a very long list. And the federal government said that no, the law is clear. You may not deny constitutional protections to people in your state, those constitutional protections that are provided by the federal government. The federal government trumps. In many ways, what you can see is a kind of teasing up for some version of our own civil war, which we're going through right now. It's not on a battlefield with muskets and cannons and guns like that, but it certainly is one in terms of values, and that's playing out now in our courts. This is where our civil war is. But are there other strategies? And again, I say, if we look back to what were the strategies that unfolded during the civil rights movement, then that might give us some room to think creatively in these spaces. So one thing that I'd encourage people to think about is the way in which we can utilize the First Amendment in this regard. So even though in the Helms Amendment, what's interesting and ironic and hypocritical is like how much the right holds on to the First Amendment, and it was exactly about gagging women abroad and providers abroad. But the reality is that during the civil rights movement, there were states that wanted to spy on, they wanted to get information on Black organizations that were organizing. They wanted membership lists. They wanted to see when those organizations were meeting, because what they wanted to do was then to be able to spy on those people and create the kinds of things that would make it very difficult for those people to be able to meet. And what civil rights groups did at that time is to claim that, well, if this information were provided to the state, this would infringe on those groups' First Amendment, their First Amendment right to assemble, the First Amendment right to be able to associate. And that strategy actually proved to be successful. So what I actually encourage us to do is to actually think, yes, within the reproductive health rights and justice realm, what are the kinds of ways that traditionally these matters have been fought, but also to pull back and to think in broader ways about the ways in which these kinds of measures can be challenged as well. One can also see this as cruel and unusual, what the state of Texas has now imposed upon any people who would want to be able to terminate a pregnancy, or people who would want to aid and abet an individual in being able to terminate a pregnancy. It also invades their privacy, right? It deputizes these citizens in ways to go about and to spy on people in ways that would not or could be unlawful if a state agent were doing it him or herself. And the state can't get around saying, well, it's not us, it's these other people, because there's already what's called state action, because the state has already delegated this.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, and just to make the point that the United Nations has identified restrictive abortion laws as discriminatory exactly on the basis that you mentioned, denying the right of bodily autonomy, the right of equality, privacy, and dignity. Criminalization of abortion amounts to gender-based violence and even cruel, inhumane, and degrading treatment. So quite firm in their position there. Let me turn to another question, which is, it's an interesting one around messaging. So, you brought up the welfare queens, and that we still remember that messaging. Do you think that there are what opportunities do you see for those of us who are supporters of abortion rights to message around this and to create a culture that respects and honors women's right to an abortion?
Messaging is so important. And one of the strategies, again, in the marathon rather than the sprint, is to redefine the messaging. So if you think about it from the context of the states that are enacting these laws, and even by members of Congress that have been sympathetic, what they've been able to do is to shape the conversation, shape heartbeat. People thinking, oh, there's a heart, I should be sensitive about that. They've taken on, interestingly enough, language of the civil rights movement, so that there's actually anti-abortion legislation named after Black abolitionists like Frederick Douglass, things that you really can't make up. So the investment in rewriting the lexicon is really important, and picking apart and pushing people when we hear them use certain terminologies that are not clarified, making sure the clarifications are there. One of the things that you mentioned is maternal mortality, and I make a point in every talk that I give, conversation that I'm involved in, is that a person is 14 times more likely to die by carrying a pregnancy to term in the United States than by terminating that pregnancy. And as a ground set, so anything after that, like, just let us be clear, 14 times more likely to die, and the state has said that that is the choice that we are making for you, and then we can go on from there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for that. So there's harkening back to an earlier question, and this is maybe kind of an interesting one for both of us. It's about the anti-choice movement, and you mentioned that it was well funded. So certainly in our work at Ipas, we see the global anti-choice movement very active in certainly in Latin America, but we also see them in Africa, and we know that they're connected to the U.S. movement. How well funded is this movement, Michele? What do you see as these connections? Say more about that.
Yeah, well, it is very well funded. And let me just say, in tying back really quickly to the last question, is that it matters who greenlights articles at the New York Times, at the Washington Post, in these spaces that are defined as papers of record, news of record. And so it matters that there are more people, more women who are in positions of power and control in those spaces to greenlight the kinds of articles that could help us think about a Texas law before Texas law occurs. But with regard to this question about, the well-fundedness, well, we have to see this not in a vacuum and not isolated from voter suppression, from anti-immigration movements, from those who push back against climate change. We have to see this within the context of what has been produced through the group calling itself the Tea Party, that rose into office during the time of Barack Obama's presidency. And when we can connect those things, we can see how well-oiled and well-funded the machine is, through organizations, names like Federalist Society, which used to be perceived as just another kind of law organization, no different than others, except this one is a little bit more conservative than others. But they're very, very well funded. The Koch brothers have spent quite a bit of money in helping to shape ideology, culture, regulation in the United States. And there are others. And again, this is part of a movement that started, that was in full swing come the 1970s, even though we're now seeing the results in 2021.
Yeah. Yeah. So, and I think we have to understand that this movement that's here is well funded. It's been, it has multiple aspects to it. It's political. It is thinking about the cultural production of messaging, of ideas, of music, of all kinds of things.
It's
Educational.
judicial.
It's judicial. It's multi-pronged. It is
Let me
multi-pronged. Go ahead.
just one quick point. During President Trump's presidency, he was able to nominate more judges to the federal bench than any other president save George Washington. And think about that a moment and connect to that he was very clear and specific about the kinds of judges that he wanted on the federal bench. Most presidents don't do what he said. I mean, he was quite explicit. He was quite explicit as he was running for president, saying that he wanted to punish women who had abortions. And he stepped back from that. But then he made clear and said that he only wanted to nominate judges that were anti-abortion and other statements as well.
Yeah.
And he got lists of people that were provided to him that followed that ideology. And I'll just make one more connection because you've talked about that intersection of race and sex, which is so important. There were judges that he nominated that could not get approval through the ABA, the American Bar Association vets people who are proposed as judges to see whether they're qualified or unqualified. And a number of the judges that he proposed were unqualified by their count as a nonpartisan organization, and now they serve on the court. But one other point that I want to make is that these judges were asked, and these people who are judges, what do you think of the precedential value of Brown v. Board of Education, something that's typically uncontroversial? And you had some of these judges that said, well, I can't say that I actually think that it has precedential value.
Right. Right. That is a very big deal. So we have more questions, which I'm afraid we're not going to get to, some of them quite specific about the law. I'm just going to end, and I know we're a little bit over time, but I'm just going to end by asking you one last question, Michele, which is, given everything that you've said about the judiciary and where we are in this country in terms of Trump's nominations of these judges, are you hopeful at all that the judicial system can help us out of this situation?
You have mentioned legislation that Congress is contemplating. There's more support than ever for the legislation that you've mentioned. And I think that is where the efforts need to be within the political spaces in Congress, at the state level, within legislatures. We need more women running for office. We need more women making demands of their legislators. And I will also say we need more people running for school boards as well, because when we're talking about reproductive health rights and justice, it actually starts in thinking about school, sexual education in school. We're one of the few countries that denies young people the opportunity to know about their bodies while in school. Some states have it, but a number of states over recent years have gutted their sex education programs.
That's right. That's exactly right. Yeah. I mean, I think, directing our action towards voting, towards Congress is really the way to go. Well, I want to thank you. And I also want to leave our audience with a little bit of hope that despite what's happening in the United States, there is good news. I talked about Mexico early on. The Mexico recent Supreme Court decision there paves the way for national legalization of abortion in that country. Argentina was a major win, and we are now implementing the law in Argentina. Countries in Africa, like the Democratic Republic of Congo, where restrictions have been softened. So we have, in the global community, we've seen a lot of progress, and those lessons and are something that we're sharing with our colleagues here in the U.S. So all is not lost.
No,
the U.S.
the U.S. has... Can I say just one last thing as we close out? I think the important message is hope. As I've thought about it a lot over the last few years since President Trump's presidency, I've thought about what is the message that a Black enslaved woman would say the night before the auction when her child is about to be auctioned off the next day and she will never see that child again. How do you sustain within a person a message of hope and dignity that we will survive this, we will get beyond this? And very often I think that message has been about never let anybody steal your joy. sort of ability to be able to wake up in the morning and to be able to cast on that fight, because there's something powerful within you, a kind of dignity within you that no one can ever take away. And I think that's important for us to understand as we move forward, to fight for the dignity of all people, and especially women and girls and non-binary persons who are affected and harmed by these kinds of laws.
Absolutely. That was so beautifully said. Thank you. It's been such a pleasure to talk to you today. And those last parting words, I think, are so wonderful to get us all kind of geared up and ready to go for the September 28th, which is the International Safe Abortion Day, to give us kind of inspiration and hope, and keep fighting as we must here in the United States and around the world. Michele Goodwin, thank you very much for joining us today, and thank you to all of our participants too for hanging in there with us.
Thank
Take
you for
care,
having
everyone.
me.